We need to move on to, well, three other people really, not just Sarah Ferguson, but also Beatrice and Eugenie that have been dragged into this. We discussed on the show in the past as to whether they should be infected by what's happening to their parents, and whether the royal family have basically kept their titles.
The Epstein files were supposed to stay buried forever. Powerful people built their lives around it, smiling for cameras, giving charity speeches, attending royal galas, absolutely confident certain documents would never surface. They were wrong. When the DOJ unsealed a sweeping batch of Jeffrey Epstein documents in early 2024, the shockwaves didn't just rattle Washington or Wall Street. They crossed the Atlantic and landed at the heart of the British royal family. The world's cameras had long been trained on Prince Andrew, waiting for the next chapter of his Epstein nightmare. But what emerged pointed somewhere nobody had anticipated: at a mother, at her daughters. And it raised questions so disturbing that veteran royal correspondents described themselves as physically shocked. What follows is not speculation or tabloid fantasy. It's documented on record, and royal insiders are calling it the most serious threat to the monarchy's credibility in a generation. Who is Sarah Ferguson? And why does it matter now? Let's start at the beginning, because context is everything here. And without it, the full weight of what these documents reveal simply cannot be understood. Sarah Ferguson, known the world over as Fergie, entered public life in 1986 when she married Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and stepped into the glare of one of the most scrutinized institutions on the planet. From the very beginning, she was a complicated figure: warm, spontaneous, loud, funny, and fiercely relatable in a way that made her simultaneously beloved and deeply controversial. She was not like the other royals. She didn't carry herself with the trained reserve that the palace expected. She laughed too loudly, spent too freely, talked too openly, and brought a chaotic human energy into an institution that prized control above almost everything else. The tabloids adored her and punished her in equal measure, elevating her one week and tearing her apart the next. It was a cycle she never quite managed to escape. When her marriage to Andrew collapsed and the divorce was finalized in 1996, the financial consequences were immediate and severe. Unlike other members of the royal family who retained their positions and incomes, Ferguson found herself on the outside, no longer a working royal, stripped of her HRH title, and faced with managing a lifestyle she could no longer afford. Reports over the years consistently painted a picture of a woman in chronic financial distress. Debts ran high. Deals fell through. The money she earned never quite kept pace with what she spent. That background matters enormously. It matters because when you understand just how financially desperate and emotionally isolated Sarah Ferguson was in the years following her divorce, the relationship she eventually developed with Jeffrey Epstein begins to make a different kind of terrible, sickening sense. Now, before we go any further, let's ask you something directly, because this is a question worth sitting with before we get into the details. If someone you knew had been convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor, if the courts had found them guilty and sent them to prison, would you maintain a close, warm, emotionally invested personal relationship with them? Would you write to them, calling them your brother, your legend, your spectacular and special friend? Most people would answer no, immediately and without hesitation. And yet that is exactly what the Epstein files reveal about Sarah Ferguson. Not once, not in a moment of confusion, but repeatedly, consistently, and in writing, long after there was any possible ambiguity about who Jeffrey Epstein was and what he had done. The emails that changed everything. When the documents were released and examined by news organizations, including Sky News, which reported extensively on the correspondence, what emerged was not a picture of a casual or arm's-length connection. Not the kind of association you might maintain with someone you'd met at a charity dinner or a mutual friend's party. The emails between Sarah Ferguson and Jeffrey Epstein painted the portrait of a relationship that was emotionally intense, personally devoted, and at times strikingly intimate in its language. In one email, believed to have been written by Ferguson to Epstein, she reportedly described being unable to find words sufficient to capture her love and gratitude for his generosity and his kindness. She ended the message with a phrase that stopped people reading it completely cold. "I am at your service." Read that again. I am at your service. Written to a convicted sex offender by a woman who was at that point a mother of 2 daughters. Now here is the detail that transforms discomfort into something far darker. That email was not written before Epstein's crimes came to light. It was not the message of a naive woman who had no idea who she was really dealing with. The timeline is unambiguous. That email was sent after Epstein had already been convicted, after the court proceedings, after the guilty plea, after the world already knew, clearly, publicly on the record, exactly what Jeffrey Epstein had done. And it was not a one-off. The correspondence continued. In an email dated August 3, 2009, Ferguson reportedly referred to Epstein as the brother I have always wished for. In other messages, she addressed him as her dear, spectacular, and special friend. She wrote that he was a legend. She said she was proud of him. Proud of him. That phrase alone generated fierce public reaction. Proud of a man serving time, or recently released from serving time, for soliciting prostitution from a child. Then there was another message, perhaps the most psychologically revealing of all. Ferguson reportedly wrote to Epstein, I am at your service. Just marry me. Observers and commentators were divided on exactly how to interpret those words. Some argued that they revealed genuine romantic attachment, that Ferguson had, at some level, fallen for Epstein in a way that overrode her judgment entirely. Others focused on a different and arguably more disturbing reading, that this was not love, or not only love, but desperation. A woman who had come to depend on someone so completely, financially, emotionally, socially, that she would write almost anything to maintain his favor and keep herself close to the resources he represented. Because the financial dimension of this relationship cannot be separated from the emotional one. Sarah Ferguson was carrying serious debt throughout this period. Epstein had, by contrast, seemingly limitless wealth. And one recording that surfaced and attracted significant media attention featured a conversation in which a payment of £500,000 was discussed, with reference to a deposit already held in a safe. The overall picture is of a woman who had allowed herself to become deeply enmeshed with a convicted sex offender, financially dependent, emotionally attached, and by the evidence of her own written words, loyal to him in a way that most people watching the story found deeply troubling to witness. All of that, on its own, would be a significant scandal, a serious story about a public figure, and a deeply flawed set of choices. But the story did not stay contained to Sarah Ferguson's own choices. The daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie. Here is where the story shifts register entirely, from troubling to something that many people who followed it described as genuinely harrowing. Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie, 2 young women who had, until the release of these files, managed to maintain meaningful distance from the worst of their parents' controversies. Beatrice and Eugenie were not their father. They were not their mother. They had, with considerable effort, built their own identities, their own public lives, their own reputations. Eugenie, in particular, had cultivated genuine respect, known for her grounded personality and her serious commitment to raising awareness around modern slavery. That detail, in the context of what the files reveal, carries an irony that is almost too painful to absorb. What the Epstein documents revealed about what their mother allegedly did, and what she allegedly exposed them to, sent shockwaves through royal circles that are still reverberating today. So, let's go through the timeline with precision, because every date in this sequence carries enormous weight. Jeffrey Epstein was released from prison in July 2009, having served his sentence following his 2008 conviction in Florida. His release was a public event. It was widely covered in the press. The nature of his offenses, soliciting prostitution from a minor, was a matter of public record. Anyone paying attention to the news knew exactly what Epstein had been convicted of. 5 days. 5 days after Jeffrey Epstein walked out of that prison, Sarah Ferguson traveled to Miami to visit him. She did not make that trip alone. She brought Beatrice and Eugenie with her. Beatrice was 19 years old at the time. Eugenie was 17. Not yet adults in the fullest sense. Young women who were, by every reasonable definition, dependent on their mother to make decisions that protected their safety and their welfare. An email from one of Epstein's aides, sent on July 24th of that year, corroborates the trip. Ferguson herself later confirmed that she had traveled to Miami with her daughters during that period. The travel costs were reportedly covered by Epstein. 5 days after his release from a prison sentence for offense involving a minor, with her daughters, paid for by him. There are very few ways to frame that sequence of facts that do not lead somewhere deeply disturbing. We want to ask you something directly, because it's a question that commentators and members of the public kept returning to when this information became known. What does a parent have to be thinking, or not thinking, to make that decision? How do you look at your children, pack their bags, and take them to visit a man who has just served time for the sexual exploitation of a minor? And this, as we are about to show you, was not an isolated lapse. It was the beginning, or rather the continuation, of a pattern. The pattern: access, apologies, and arrangements. What makes the Miami trip so significant is not just what it was in isolation. It's what it reveals about what had become normalized inside Sarah Ferguson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and what her daughters had come to represent within that relationship. Because the documents do not show a one-time visit born of poor judgment. They show a sustained pattern of behavior in which Ferguson appeared to actively facilitate ongoing contact between Epstein and her daughters across months and years, with a casualness that was, to those reading the emails, almost as disturbing as the content itself. In March 2010, an email from Epstein to Ferguson surfaced in which he asked whether one of her daughters could give him a private tour of Buckingham Palace. The request was framed conversationally, almost offhandedly, as though this were the kind of favor one asks without much ceremony. Ferguson's reported response was 2 words: "Of course." No hesitation, no pause. Of course. Now let us be very clear about what Buckingham Palace represents. This is not a hotel lobby. It is not a public building that members of the public can book for tours. It is the official London residence of the British monarch. Access to it is tightly controlled, deeply symbolic, and, in any normal set of circumstances, entirely off-limits to a convicted offender. And yet, according to the documents, Sarah Ferguson arranged that access for Jeffrey Epstein with apparent ease and with no apparent conflict about what she was doing. There was another email, one that several commentators described as particularly telling, in which Ferguson apologized to Epstein for her daughters not being available to see him on a particular weekend. One had been in France, the other had been out with a friend. Ferguson reportedly noted this with what was described as casual lightness, adding that this showed she didn't crack the whip when it came to managing their schedules. The significance of the tone there is hard to overstate. She was not apologizing for a missed formal occasion or a social obligation gone wrong. She was apologizing to a convicted offender for her teenage daughter's unavailability, in a register that made their regular access to him sound like a standing arrangement, something routine, something expected. There was also a separate message in which Epstein asked whether Ferguson's daughters could greet a friend of his who was visiting London, again framed casually, again treated by Ferguson's reported response as an unremarkable request. And then there was Beatrice's 18th birthday party, a milestone event, a celebration of a young woman's passage into adulthood, one of the most personal and family-oriented occasions in a person's life. When it emerged that Jeffrey Epstein had been present at that party, invited presumably by their mother, and when a photograph from the event circulated publicly with that context attached to it, the reaction was one of widespread visceral disbelief. Taken together, these details build something that cannot be explained away as a series of isolated mistakes. What they describe is a world in which Epstein's access to Ferguson's daughters had become, by any reading of the evidence, normalized, routine, scheduled, a feature of ordinary life rather than an aberration from it. The most serious allegation, and why it gained traction. We must be precise about what follows, because responsible reporting demands it. A royal insider made an allegation. That allegation was reported by journalists. Sarah Ferguson has firmly and consistently denied it. It has not been proven in any court of law or any legal proceeding. We are presenting it as what it factually is, an unverified allegation from an unnamed source. We are presenting it nonetheless, because the response of the public and of commentary around this story was not to dismiss it. and understanding why it gained the traction it did requires examining the evidence that surrounded it. The allegation was this: that Sarah Ferguson pressured her daughters into sleeping in Jeffrey Epstein's bed. Ferguson's denial has been clear and unambiguous, but here is why, for many observers, that denial did not close the conversation. The allegation did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived against the backdrop of the Miami trip 5 days after his prison release. The Buckingham Palace tour arranged without hesitation, the birthday party invitation, the emails in which a convicted offender was described as a legend and a source of pride, the apologies for daughters' unavailability that read like apologies for a canceled appointment. When that body of documented evidence exists, an allegation that in any other context might seem too extreme to take seriously starts to register differently. It becomes something that people find themselves unable to set aside simply because it hasn't been proven. And this is worth sitting with. At what point does a pattern of documented behavior shift our threshold for what we consider possible? How much context does it take before we stop saying, "that couldn't happen," and start asking, "did it?" Beatrice and the journalist, protecting his reputation. There is a strand of this story that has received less attention than the more dramatic elements, but which reveals something important about the psychological depth of what was happening within that family unit. Sarah Ferguson gave an interview to a journalist, reportedly an attempt to shape how she was being covered in relation to Epstein and to present herself in a favorable light. When Epstein saw the resulting article and reportedly expressed displeasure with how it had turned out, Ferguson wrote about the situation in an email. She described sitting down with Beatrice and the two of them reaching a shared conclusion, that the journalist needed to be called back, and that he needed to be made to understand that he should not make errors in his coverage of Jeffrey Epstein. The language used to describe Epstein in that email was stark. He had been sent to prison unfairly. He had served his time. He was moving on with his life and deserved to have that respected in print. What we are looking at in that email is a mother and her daughter, sitting together, reasoning together, and arriving at the conclusion that their job was to protect the public image of a convicted offender. Child development specialists and psychologists who commented publicly on this aspect of the story were careful to frame it with appropriate nuance. They noted that what looks on the surface like a young person independently sharing and endorsing a parent's views may, in reality, reflect something far more complicated. Years of consistent exposure to a parent's perspective, particularly where that parent holds authority over the child's social world, can shape a young person's thinking in ways that feel entirely internal and genuine, but which are in fact the product of prolonged influence. The experts used the word conditioning. They were careful to say it was not the same as knowing participation in wrongdoing, but they were equally careful to say it was not the same as innocent, uninformed agreement. Beatrice, in other words, may have believed she was simply expressing her own view. The question the experts raised was whether, given everything surrounding that view, she had ever truly been given the conditions necessary to form one independently. Mother's Army, the most jarring contradiction of all. Of all the details that emerged from the Epstein files regarding Sarah Ferguson, there is one that has stayed with people in a particular way, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it captures the entire moral contradiction of this story in a single, almost unbelievable detail. Sarah Ferguson was building a women's empowerment brand. She had given it a name. She called it Mother's Army, a women's empowerment initiative built around the concept of supporting, uplifting, and advocating for women, named, pointedly, after mothers. According to the correspondents, Ferguson's plans for this venture included granting Jeffrey Epstein a controlling 51% ownership stake in it. The man convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor, the man whose name would later become a byword for the systematic exploitation of young women and girls. That man, according to the documents, was being positioned as the majority owner of a brand whose entire stated purpose was the empowerment of women. Ferguson would hold the title, give the speeches, and be the face that donors and partners and press would see. Epstein would hold the control. An email from one of Epstein's associates, written following a dinner attended by Ferguson, Prince Andrew, and their daughters, laid out the potential commercial advantages of this arrangement, in terms that were clinical and deliberate. The benefits cited included leveraging Ferguson's social network and connections. There were references to other potential advantages that were not spelled out in detail. Beatrice and Eugenie were at that dinner. They were in the room, present while the business arrangement was being discussed, while the adults in their lives negotiated over who would own a women's empowerment venture and what Epstein stood to gain from it. Whether the ownership transfer was ever formally completed remains, as of reporting, unclear. But the planning was advanced, the intent was documented, and the person whose ownership stake was being arranged had, by that point, a criminal record for the exploitation of a minor. The fallout, swift, severe, and ongoing. When the full content of the correspondence became publicly known, the consequences arrived quickly and from multiple directions at once. Charitable organizations that had been publicly associated with Sarah Ferguson moved to create distance within days. This was not surprising. In the world of philanthropy, where institutional reputation determines everything from donor confidence to trustee retention to public credibility, being linked to a scandal of this magnitude is not a manageable situation. It is an existential threat. The organizations that moved quickly were making a calculation, and the calculation was not a difficult one. Her commercial life faced simultaneous pressure. Ferguson had invested enormous energy over many years in rebuilding a sustainable public profile and income. The writing career, both her romance fiction and her children's books, represented stability that had been hard-won after years of well-documented financial chaos. Reports indicated that at least one forthcoming publication date had been moved. Conversations were reportedly underway with publishers about how to handle existing stock. These details may seem peripheral against the larger story, but they are meaningful. A publisher's willingness to move a release date is a commercial signal, not a moral one. It tells you that the people with money at stake have done their analysis and concluded that the public appetite for this person's work has shifted. For Ferguson, who had battled financial instability for decades, this shift represented a genuine and serious threat. The response from the British public was particularly forceful. Commentators who had covered the royal family for years described the tone of public reaction as something they had rarely encountered. Not just disapproval, not just scandal fatigue, but what one described as a deeply felt sense of moral disgust. The phrase national disgrace circulated widely, applied to both Ferguson and Prince Andrew. Calls were made for formal consequences, for some kind of public accounting, for the palace to do more than simply stay silent. The monarchy under pressure. The palace's problem was that this scandal had tentacles that reached into the symbolic heart of the institution itself. Buckingham Palace. The image of a convicted offender being given a private tour of Buckingham Palace, arranged by a member of the extended royal family, involving her daughters, was not simply a story about bad personal judgment. It was a story about what kind of institution the monarchy had become, about who was being given access, and why, and on whose authority. The royal family responded as it nearly always does in moments of crisis, with silence, with distance, and with the implicit hope that time would do the work that words couldn't. No statement, no direct engagement, no public reckoning. Many observers believed this was a strategic error, not because public statements would have resolved anything, but because the silence read, in the context of what had been revealed, as an extension of the same instinct towards self-protection that had allowed this situation to develop in the first place. Keep it contained, wait it out, trust that the public will move on. But the Epstein story, by its nature, does not move on. The legal processes in the United States are ongoing. Documents continue to surface and be analyzed. The pressure for accountability is not decreasing. And the involvement of people connected to one of the world's most prominent royal families ensures that every new development receives international attention. The question of how King Charles's court would ultimately respond, whether through formal distancing, title reviews, or some other form of public consequence, remained, at the time of reporting, unresolved. But the expectation that it could simply be waited out was looking, to most serious observers, increasingly unrealistic. Beatrice and Eugenie, the women at the center. And now, we arrive at the question that sits underneath everything else in this story. the one that has no clean answer, and may not for years. What do Beatrice and Eugenie know? What did they experience? And what, if anything, do they intend to do about it? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that determine whether a full accounting of what happened during those years is ever actually possible. Because no collection of emails, however extensive, and no number of corroborating accounts, however credible, carries the evidentiary and human weight of testimony from someone who was physically present. Beatrice and Eugenie were physically present. They were in Miami 5 days after Epstein's release from prison. They were at the birthday party. They were at the dinner where Mother's Army was discussed. Their names appear in the correspondence. Their unavailability is apologized for. Their access to Epstein is treated in the written record as something scheduled and expected. They know things, and the world can only infer what those things are. Here is the question we want you to genuinely consider. If you were one of these women, if you had grown up inside this story, been present at these events, shaped in ways you may only now be beginning to understand by your mother's relationship with this man, what would the right choice look like? Would you speak? Would you stay silent to protect yourself, your family, your children? Is there a version of this story where staying silent is the ethical choice, or is silence at some point its own form of complicity? There are no easy answers here, and it would be both unfair and dishonest to pretend that the choice these women face is simple. They did not create this situation. They were brought into it as teenagers. The decisions that placed them inside Epstein's world were not theirs to make. Whatever psychological conditioning may have shaped their understanding of it during those years, that conditioning was not something they chose. They were there, and the world is watching and waiting to understand what being there meant. The reckoning that isn't finished. Here is what we know for certain as this story stands. The Epstein files are real. The emails are on the record. The timeline is documented and confirmed. The Miami trip happened. The birthday party happened. The business discussions happened. The Buckingham Palace arrangement was proposed. These are not allegations. These are facts established through documentary evidence reported on by multiple credible news organizations. And at the center of all of it, not as bystanders, not as distant names mentioned in passing, but as actively present participants, were two young women who are now adults, with families of their own, trying to live lives that this story keeps reaching back to claim. The word that kept appearing throughout all of the commentary and analysis of these files was leverage. Not naivety, not poor judgment, leverage. The suggestion, articulated carefully by those who raised it, disputed by Ferguson's defenders, was that the daughter's presence in Epstein's world was not an accident and was not simply the result of a mother who didn't know better. It was a resource, a means of maintaining a position, sustaining a relationship, keeping access open to the money and the validation and the sense of being seen that Epstein provided. Whether that assessment is entirely fair remains a genuine question. The argument that Ferguson was herself manipulated, that she was a victim of Epstein's extraordinary ability to identify and exploit vulnerability, has real credibility in relation to her own choices. Predators like Epstein do not target the strong and the certain. They target the desperate and the isolated. And Ferguson was, by the evidence, both. But that argument reaches its limit when the conversation turns to her daughters, because they were more vulnerable than she was. They were younger. They were less experienced. They were dependent on her in a way she was never dependent on them. And the evidence suggests that their welfare was not, in practice, the first consideration in the decisions that were made. The legal processes are ongoing. The documents continue to emerge. The pressure for accountability continues to build. And Beatrice and Eugenie have not yet said publicly what they know or how they feel. Until they do, if they ever choose to, the complete truth of what happened during those years remains where it has always been, with the people who were there. And that silence, for now, is the loudest thing in the room. If this story has raised questions you think more people need to be asking, share it. The conversation about accountability for every person touched by the Epstein network is not finished. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. In a story like this one, there is always a next chapter.